My guest today is a fantasy novelist whose rise from online serial writer to international bestseller has made her one of the defining voices in modern fantasy. She began writing young, producing her first novella in 6th grade, and later returned to storytelling in earnest when she started Air Awakens in 2012 as a hobby, posting chapters online and building an early community of devoted readers. After querying the book without success, she chose to publish it independently in 2015, a decision that gave her full creative control and transformed her career. Within a year, she had become a full-time author, and soon afterwards, her work began appearing on bestseller lists from USA Today to the New York Times. Since then, her novels have reached readers around the world, selling millions of copies and spawning a string of beloved fantasy series, including The Loom Saga, Married to Magic, Dragon Cursed, and Arcana Academy. Next, she returns to that world with Prince of Swords, one of her most eagerly awaited books yet, out in July. Welcome, Elise Kova.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like I sound so much more impressive than I generally feel on the day-to-day when you read that bio.
Well, it's super impressive, and I can't wait to hear your story. But before all of that, why don't we start talking about your new book, Prince of Swords, out in July. Tell us, how do you describe it to someone when you're stuck in an elevator and they say, hey, what's your book about?
Always a struggle. Every author panics at that question.
Right.
I describe Prince of Swords, which is set in the world of Arcana Academy. It is a story about a magic user who has used illegal tarot magic. Tarot magic is highly regulated in this world. Magic flows through specially inked tarot cards. And she has been imprisoned for not going through the proper channels to use this magic. She escapes only to find out that her escape was orchestrated by the prince she believes who put her there. And he gives her a proposition that she can earn her freedom if she helps him steal a legendary power from his father, the king. So just some light treason. And she, of course, is like, if I have the ability to steal this legendary power, I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to do it for myself. So begins kind of a cat and mouse that turns into a slow burn romance of a deal between the two of them as she enters into Arcana Academy herself, of which he is also the headmaster. And a lot of hijinks ensue. Prince of Swords is the second book set in this world, so we are returning to the world of Arcana Academy, and it starts off immediately after the end of book 1, which I'm sure readers will be very happy about because many of them wanted to throw the book at me probably with the way that book 1 ended.
Wow, you are very good at that. That is a super compelling synopsis. Good job.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, I mean, this series, like, as you say, it sort of, has forbidden magic, forbidden desire, political intrigue, academy intrigue, all of these different threads. What were you most excited to return to with book 2?
I think with book 2, one of the things that I was really excited to return to was the Academy itself. And Arcana Academy is a trilogy. And in every book of the trilogy, I wanted to return to the Academy in a very different way from the previous book. So you see it each time, but it's not just like, okay, Arcana Academy book 1 is year 1 in the Academy. Year 2 or book 2 is year 2 in the Academy, and you're just going through 3 years in the Academy as a student. And I wanted there to be an evolution of Clara, the main character, of her as a person navigating this world. And so while she does go back to the Academy after the events of book 1, which I won't spoil the ending of, but I will say after the events of book 1, she cannot return as a student anymore. But she has to return because the Academy has things she needs inside of it. So how she navigates returning is a big part of the first part of book 2. And there's some pretty intense moments as she figures that out.
I'm interested, like if we go back to the middle of the 20th century and we think about fantasy at that time, I might be wrong at this, but my understanding is, it was kind of one thing, right? There was Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all of that. And that was kind of what fantasy was to most people at that time. Right now, you're writing in kind of lots of little micro genres all around this. And what you've described there is one of them, but you also do romantic fantasy and romantasy, which I've been informed by your publicist are 2 different genres, even though they sound like they might be the same. But you work in both of them. I mean, yeah, do you see these as like specific categories? What's the difference between them? Help me understand.
Yeah, I always tell people read what you enjoy. Don't get too hung up on genres. Some people feel like they're like, I'll only read this genre. And it's like, but you're closing yourself off. Like if this other book sounds really interesting, read that other book. For me, I kind of draw the distinction of which one leads. So I have my Married to Magic, for example, is a romantasy. And I define personally a romantasy as the romance is driving the plot. It is a romance novel that is set in a fantasy world. And if you took away the romance, you really wouldn't have a story because it is the romance that is driving the actions of the characters and driving their agency and the plot movement as a result. Fantasy romance, that is one which is sometimes interchangeably with romantic fantasy. I tend to personally trend toward fantasy romance, is a fantasy with a heavy dose of romance. So Arcana Academy, for example, I view that as like epic fantasy to fantasy romance because it has a heavy dose of romance, but you could take away the romance and the plot would still work, the characters would still work, the plot would still move. The
Right.
motivations are
Mm.
not solely rooted in the romance. And that is my personal distinction between the two. But it is something that is quite nebulous, even within the industry. There's much debate. I was on a panel at BookCon in New York City earlier or mid last month where we were talking about it with two other authors and our moderator, and it was a whole discussion on what is romantasy, what is fantasy romance. So there's not one answer is the honest answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've given a really clear answer there, and I think understanding, what elements are plot and driving things forward is a really useful sort of way of framework, right? I mean, for you personally, when you sit down to write, are you thinking predominantly about the fantasy architecture? Are you thinking about romantic tension, and what excites you personally in terms of these things?
It really depends on the book because obviously if I'm sitting down and I know I'm writing a romantasy, I really do focus on okay, what is the mechanics of the romance. So I love writing. I write a lot of slow burn because I love that tension and I love that buildup. When I am conceptualizing my stories, I think about the romance a lot more in the story arc of the romance itself because romances have a story arc to them. I also think, why can't these characters be together immediately? Or if they can, what is the tension that's happening between them? And, I also really like to write characters in romances where each character is wounded and the other character is what prompts them to heal. While I don't ascribe to the philosophy of like someone else can fix you, I think you have to fix yourself. I do think at the same time, I feel like a lot of us have met those people in our lives, whether it is a romantic partner or a best friend or even a close, a family member or something like that, where you are inspired to better yourself as a result of that person. And that's the kind of romances that I like to write. But I love magic systems. I love building out a tarot-inspired magic system for Arcana Academy and the magic systems I've had the privilege of writing in my other books. And I love building the world. I love the nuances. I think a lot about power structures, soft power and hard power, and who holds power, and what do they do to get it, and how does that impact the mechanics of those things.
Very cool. Very clear as well. Thank you. One thing that readers are always interested in is how steamy their romantic fantasy or their fantasy romance is going to be. This series, where does that sit on that spectrum? I mean, you said you like a slow burn. What are the sort of, where are you comfortable, and what are your hard limits with this kind of thing, if that's not too crass a question?
No, it's such a fair question. I'm just laughing because it's like I've had people with some of my books be like, the chili pepper scale is very common. For anyone who's listening who doesn't know,
Right.
it's like out of 5 chili peppers with, 0 being there's nothing and 5 chili peppers is very, very hot and spicy. Like where does a book sit?
The Scoville of sexiness type thing.
The Scoville of sexiness, exactly. The problem is that there's not one consistent, like Scoville is based on like science and stuff. And like this is not, it is so based on perception. Because I've had readers be
Right.
like, oh, your books are, like a 4 or a 5. And then I've had other readers be like, your books are barely a 1. So I find for Arcana Academy, I would sit it but comfortably around a 3 out of 5. And ±1, depending on how spicy you tend to read your books. If you don't read very many spicy books, you might feel like it's a little spicier. If you read a lot, you might feel like it's very tame. But there is intimacy on the page. It is descriptive, detailed intimacy on the page. And in both books, Arcana Academy and Prince of Swords, there is multiple instances of it. So again, while I do consider the romance to be a function of the story and not the story itself, I think that, physical intimacy can tell a lot about characters, and there's a lot of growth that can happen during physical intimacy. And I think that, a lot of people like to kind of like tee hee hee and like or roll their eyes at the romance, but I think about it from the perspective of when characters are intimate, in what way are they intimate, and what is it saying about their relationship, and what is it saying about themselves, and that level of vulnerability that they have to give. So there is a lot of thought that goes into it beyond how creative or titillating can you be when it comes to those types of scenes.
Why? So, from the intro that I gave you, listeners will know, if they didn't already know, that this kind of writing has just exploded in popularity. It's so huge, dominant even within sort of publishing at the moment. Why do you think that might be? And I suppose the question beneath that is, when there is so much titillating material in our world right now, readily accessible, why do you think this style of book that was, sort of perhaps people were reading sort of in the 1950s for titillation, why do you think that's come back?
I think it's a number of factors, and it's hard to put your finger on any one of them. And I wish I had a clear answer, because it would mean that I have some kind of like grand insight into the industry about why things are happening, and then I could predict the future. Ugh, I wish. But I think that, we saw the rise of romantasy as we understand it today, because this is a genre that has existed for a very long time. There have been writers in this space writing romantic fantasy novels for a long time, but it just didn't have the name, and it didn't have the branding around it. And we hadn't seen it it was a little bit more of like a niche thing that if you knew where to look, you knew where to look. And if you knew the authors that were doing it, you knew who to look for. But I think that we saw kind of this meteoric rise of this genre. I would place it around 2020. And I think there were two factors that played into that. One is probably not surprising. I think the pandemic did play a factor. Books in general they were safe. They were something you could get delivered to your home. They were a good form of entertainment, a good form of escapism. I know I was writing books in 2020 to escape the how hard the world felt in that moment.
Right.
And so I think you had that combining with the rise and adoption of TikTok, not just as, oh, that's a silly dance social media, but and the TikTok algorithm was so good, especially at that time, at creating these sort of communities and echo chambers, and just being like, oh, this is exactly what you like to a niche level, not just like, oh, you like books, here's some stuff about books, but you've interacted with these three things, and so we know that this is exactly what you want. And so I think you had this combination of people had time to read, and they had a reason to have a renewed interest and a reason to want to escape the world, combined with TikTok introducing readers to books in a very fast and organic way, and allowing readers to band together around the genre. And I think one of the things about the romantasy genre that, I really have found fascinating is that romance has always been a female and, queer kind of dominated space. And romantasy is just the same. And so I think there's also a narrative there about the buying power of women and what it means. And I think that to expand on that point, to answer the other part of your question about why this when there's so many other titillating material, is I think it comes to what I was saying about vulnerability and intimacy and whatnot, is that it's not just the fact that it's titillating material. Generally speaking, most people who I know who read this book are not, they're not reading to be titillated. I mean, it's a perk if it happens, I guess, for some people, but they're reading because of the emotions. They're reading because it is grounded in a lot of times the female experience, and there are fantasies involved in there of, female pleasure and women owning their pleasure, which is something that for a really long time and even still into today in some communities is not accepted. And so I think that there was a freeing element to that too, of like, oh, these are women who own their pleasure, who are not ashamed of their pleasure, who are entering into relationships and being vulnerable with men. And these, the wish fulfillment fantasy in some instances of like, here are these strong, burly, gruff men, but who are gentle and consent focused and, caring and loving to their partners. And I think all of that played a really big factor in it as well.
Great answer. Thank you for sharing those insights. Amazing.
Thank you for asking.
We better come to to the premise of the podcast. I've asked you to pick the 5 video games you'd like to put on your ideal fictional games machine. You picked 5 Japanese bangers, I would say. I'm very excited to hear you talk about these. We're going back to 1998 for your first game, a Nintendo 64 title. Tell us, what's the game and why do you love it?
The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I feel like I date myself so much by like calling out my formative games. But, the N64, I was first introduced to video games with the NES. But it was my sister's console. So I played Duck Hunt. I failed epically as a young kid with Metroid, the original one. I was enamored with Final Fantasy, even if I couldn't figure it out, the first one. But the N64 was the first console that was mine. And I don't even remember how I got The Legend of Zelda. I don't remember. I think it was a gift. And I have probably played that game, oh gosh, at least 30 times in my life, which is almost averaging like one a year.
That's so good.
Little less than, but I think for me, Ocarina of Time, it is just that quintessential story that I think we all love, where it starts out kid in a small town kind of thing. Like, because that's what, not Kakaro Village. Wow, I should have done more research on the games that I said instead of trusting myself to remember on the spot. But you start out in, the initial village, and you start out with the Great Deku Tree and like you then go out and you find all of the stones and you think that's the end of the game. And then you have the age jump. I hope there's no spoilers for a game that is like really old,
No,
by the way.
Yeah.
But I think I'm safe. But it was like, I think that's what kept having me coming back to that game, was all of the layers that were there and how full the world was, and how I felt like every time I played it, I made a different connection, or I noticed something else about the story, and how immersive it was. I mean, I feel like it was foundational to open world games as we know them today, even. Like, it was foundational to RPGs and storytelling and open world games. It's such a good game. Fight me, that is one of the best games of all time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It comes up relatively rarely on the show, I think, because Breath of the Wild is so popular, and of course Tears of the Kingdom, but really Ocarina of Time is the game that started it all, really, in terms of modern Zelda and what we understand. And like you say, all the other open world games that have drawn so much from it. Amazing.
And I love Breath of the Wild, don't get me wrong. For me, it's like Breath of the Wild is like, it feels like you're chasing that high still, that Ocarina of Time was. That just might never be achieved again because it was so novel and new when it happened.
All right, Elise, let's come to your story. So tell me, whereabouts? You're in Florida right now. Is that where you grew up?
Yes. I'm on the west coast of Florida now. I grew up on the east coast. So I actually grew up just south of Cape Canaveral, where they shoot off the space shuttle.
Oh, amazing. Okay. And why was that? Because your family was involved with NASA or something?
So my I think the family lore, as it goes, is my grandparents moved from the northeast of the U.S. Down to Florida, as many do when they want to retire. They want to get out of the snow and dealing with the cold. And my parents had my sister at that point, and I think I was a notion. But they were like, we want to be closer to family. We want to have, our children to have that relationship. And so they moved down. So my dad didn't work for NASA specifically, but he was a computer engineer and worked with a large company that had a lot of like government defense contracts, but it was a private sector.
Right, got it. So does that mean there were computers around in the home when you were little?
Yeah, I built my first computer when I was like, I was young. I was like 8 or so when I built my first computer. Like I was
young.
little.
Wait, what do you mean? You actually put a PC together?
My dad and I put a PC together as a project. Now, he definitely did a lot of the more fine pointed work of like, you don't want to bend the pins or you're screwed, or like applying the heat paste and things like that. Like that was more him. But anything that he could have me snap in, he wanted me to do that. And he just he wanted me to have that exposure to it and to know like, these are the parts of a computer. This is what these different things do. I am by no means a computer whiz, but I'm not intimidated if we open up a tower.
Right, very cool. And yeah, I mean, what kind of kid were you?
I think I was very curious, probably a bit precocious looking back on it. I probably shouldn't admit this because I always feel like sometimes as an author, you're supposed to be like inspirational to people. But I was very much, in school and stuff, like what is the least amount of effort I can put in for the maximum reward. And I felt like I was always trying to hack that equation for my classes.
Right.
But I was always interested in the arts. I was always interested. I did a lot of drawing and painting and music and theater and, of course, writing.
Right. Okay. And so, yeah, what was your main sort of interest? Was it art, or was it reading, or were you a theatre kid?
It was probably evenly split, honestly, between those two. Yeah, and again, theater was a big one because I grew up on musical theater. Like I knew all the words to Phantom of the Opera at a very young age. There was actually a moment that I was on the street in England, in London specifically, on the West End, trying not to cry because we were going to see Phantom in, I think it's in His Majesty's Theatre. They renamed it.
Yeah, it was
right?
Her Majesty's,
but it was Her Majesty's Theatre. And they double booked the seats. Like it was just like a ticket glitch in the system. And the rules were whoever's in the seat, like if both tickets are authentic, in the glitch, who's ever in the seat first gets to stay. And we weren't there first. And like, I was just like a mess on the side. Like,
come all the way from Florida.
All the way from Florida. Luckily, that was not the only stop on our trip. But I was like, I think I was 11 or 12 when we did that trip. And I was just like, I'm not going to cry. I'm a big kid. I'm not going to cry.
I think it's hilarious that Phantom of the Opera is such a funny musical for you to know all the words to. Is that for a little kid to know all the words to? It's amazing. That's great. And then, so what were your kind of dreams coming out of all of this? You've got all these different interests. What were you thinking you might do with your life at that stage?
I wanted to be a paleontologist. My
Nice.
first career that I wanted to be, like, once I realized that, magical girl wasn't a career and I couldn't be Sailor Moon or Rainbow Bright, was paleontology. I loved dinosaurs and I loved the idea of digging around and going to cool places and digging around in the dirt and finding some bones.
I guess you have those in Florida. Is that one of the places that they dig them up?
No, they don't.
No.
Florida.
Oh, it's too swampy, I guess.
Yeah, it's too. I mean, we have you can find some like marine fossils, but those aren't exciting as like the big teeth and stuff.
Right. Okay. That's so funny. And then, and video games. When did you get your first system, or did you play them on this PC that you and your dad built?
I never got that much into PC gaming, if I'm being totally honest. I which is very odd. I've always flirted with PC gaming. I've played PC games. I played a little bit of MUDs when I was in like high school and stuff, and I play some PC games now. But yeah, I was kind of a console person, and like I said, my sister got the NES, but I think the N64 was my first console, and I got it pretty soon after it was released. I don't remember when that console was released.
What,
So
the N64? 1997, I think.
1997. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. So then I would have, because I think I got it like within the first like 2 years. So I would say I was somewhere between like 8 and 10 when I got my first console.
Okay, well, we'll come back to your story in a minute, but for now, let's come to your second game. So this is for the PlayStation 2 from 2001. Tell us, what's the game?
Final Fantasy X. Please insert here the really bad laughter from Tidus when Tidus and Yuna are standing on that like balcony
Horrible.
thing.
Yeah.
That horrible laughter. No, Final Fantasy, man. As you can see, I got another console. I got a PlayStation 2. That's how Final Fantasy came into my life.
So this was your first Final Fantasy game?
Yeah, so like I said, I played a little bit of the original on the NES when my sister had it, but I was so little, I could not figure it out. I just thought everything looked cool. And then I was like,
yeah.
What do you mean you have to do things? I just want to look at cool stuff. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy that I really played through. I played a little bit at friends' houses who had the PlayStation of 7 and 8 and 9. And I did go back after I got the PlayStation, and I played 8 and 9. Is on my list of shame that I've actually never played Final Fantasy 7. I know the whole story by now, but I'm like, can I call myself a gamer? But yeah, so it was the first Final Fantasy that I played through.
Nice. And yeah, what was it about this game that grabbed you particularly?
I think the opening sequence, Blitzball is of course a little bit silly. Like I think we can all, it's a little bit silly, but I think the opening sequence, not necessarily the Blitzball, but the when Sin destroys Xanarkand, and that happens in like literally the opening sequence, and all of that goes down, and by the time you're basically the prologue, by the time you finish, like you're like, what the heck just happened? And I think that originally hooked me. I think the other thing that hooked me was, of course, the graphics. I felt like that game was kind of a landmark game because I think it was among, I don't want to say it was the first because I don't know that stat, but I think it was among the first games too where it had voiceover acting.
Yeah, sure.
I'm trying to think of what other ones, and I'm sure there was some, but voiceover acting in the cutscenes and stuff, and just the graphics combined with the voiceover acting created this immersive experience that I hadn't had with a game before, and that made it really impactful to me.
Makes me think as well, like, we were talking earlier about these fine distinctions in fantasy, and Final Fantasy has that so much, right? If you compare 8 to 9, where you've got, and 10 as well, those three games, they're all kind of, they're coming from the same teams, or as, at least from the same studio, but they have such a different take on their way of dealing with fantasy and relationships and all that kind of thing, haven't they?
Yeah, and that's what I always loved about the Final Fantasy genre, is that every time, you would pick up a game, it sort of had that very unique story. It had the soul of a Final Fantasy game, but it was something so different than the last.
right, let's come back to your story. So tell me about the first story that you wrote.
So the first story that I wrote, not counting like scribbles on pages that my grandma stapled together for me and called it a book very generously. The first one that I really kind of remember that I go, oh, that's a story, is in sixth grade, our teacher gave us a challenge of, by the end of the year, we had to write a story that was at least 5,000 words, which in sixth grade was like, okay, that's a substantial
That's a
amount.
decent
And
amount,
I said,
yeah.
I want to write a chapter book. And my teacher was like, you're not going to write a chapter book, just write your 5,000 words. And I was like, bet. Which was like the most dangerous thing to say to me, because I then proceeded to say, I'm going to write a chapter book, and I typed it up, and I still have, I think I have not only somewhere the original file, but I have the printed manuscript that my parents very kindly printed. It ended up being,
nice.
It was not finished, but it was novella length. I think it ended up being like 35,000 words or so by the end of the year.
Holy crap. Wow.
And so...
how old are you at this point?
So sixth grade, I would probably be like 12, give or take.
It's pretty impressive. Not many 12-year-olds have written 35,000 word novellas, I don't think.
I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but it does exist.
The words were there.
The words were there. There was a story. I still remember the first line of it. Like, and pardon?
Tell us the first line.
It was not the first bar fight Kilika had ever seen, and yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the bloody mess on the floor.
Very good. I'm in. Yeah, let's go.
Like, there is a part of me that has thought about like pulling it out and being like with adults and, adult eyes and experience, being like, what would here, if anything, is worth using? And like,
yeah.
I've thought about resuscitating that story into something publishable, but I have not. I have not to this
Just
day.
make the bar fight into an orgy and you're off.
That certainly would be a shocking way to start a book.
Oh, very good. So, yeah, how did your teacher react then when you handed in? She or he has asked for 5,000 words, and you've handed in however many times more than that.
I do remember her saying that she wasn't going to read all of it, and that she was only going to read the first 5,000. And I was admittedly quite disappointed in that, and a little bit bitter about it for a long time. In retrospect, I understand. I would probably not want to read 35,000 words of a 12-year-old's attempt at a novel.
On a teacher's salary.
On a teacher's salary, when you also have, an entire class of other kids turning in their projects too. But she was very encouraging. I'll give her that credit.
Oh, that's good. Nice. And then, so when you did that, were there people around you going, oh, you could be a writer? Like, you obviously care about this kind of thing and can produce writing at this length, or was it something you sort of put away as a sort of, I've done that now?
So after that, I didn't really keep writing in long form content in that way. I did a lot of poetry, as a lot of really angsty teenagers do in high school. But I didn't necessarily, like, I had ideas for books now and then, but I was kind of more focused on reading and, more focused on, like, I would do like little like text RPGs with my friends and that kind of thing. And that sort of was my outlet for writing in that way. And I didn't write, I'm trying to think, I didn't write another like actual novel until I wrote Air Awakens.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So yeah, fill in the time between, this being in sixth grade and writing Air Awakens. What did you go off to college? What was happening in your life?
Yeah, so I went to high school, did that, as many do, and then I went immediately on to college, graduated college, went immediately after college into my master's program. I did not study any kind of English or creative writing. A lot of people like to be like, is that what you studied? I'm like, no. My undergraduate was a degree that effectively translates to like the psychology of marketing. And my master's is in business. So my background
Okay.
is in marketing and business. And then after I finished my master's, I did apply to PhD programs. I didn't get into any, which I think was a good thing, honestly, because I don't think I had a very clear picture of who I was and what I wanted. And that probably showed in my application. And that's probably why they didn't accept me.
That can sometimes happen as well. Like for people who go straight into a master's and finish that, there's that thing of like, or maybe I'll just like stay in education for a little bit longer, because it can be intimidating to take the step out of those systems, right?
Yeah, I think it was that. I think it was also my mom was a teacher and had become a college professor. And I was like, oh, a college professor sounds like I kind of like that idea. I like teaching.
Yep.
And to do that, you have to have a PhD, generally speaking, not in all cases, but it's highly recommended. So, I applied for PhD programs. Those didn't pan out. And then I decided that I was going to have a life adventure because I had, I feel like that TikTok sound that's like, I'm 27 and I have no money and no prospects and I'm scared. But I sold off everything I owned and I moved to Japan for 2 years
No
and
way.
lived there. And then
Whereabouts?
so I studied abroad in Japan at Kansai Gaidai during my college years, just for a semester. But that kind of like gave me the okay, I could live here. And then when I moved back, I moved to Ibaraki-ken, which is a prefecture. It's like too north of Tokyo. So you have Tokyo, Chiba, and then Ibaraki. It is a very rural area, lots of rice fields. Very beautiful though.
And were you teaching English then?
Yeah, I moved over. And I started teaching English at an Eikaiwa, which is an English conversation school, and then I moved from that into an international school because the town that I was in has a really large foreigner population because it's a big research town. There's a lot of like scientists that come in from around the world, and so there are these international schools where they cater in towns like this to individuals who are coming in and they're not making this country like their permanent home, and they know that they're here on a contract for 5 years or something, where it's long enough that you got to find a school, you got to enroll the kids, you got to make sure the education continues, but it's short enough that you're going, is it worth it to learn the local language and whatnot? And so a lot of these individuals would enroll in international schools where they are teaching entirely in English. The whole school is conducted in English as the thought being basically English is a little bit of more of a transferable language. And so
Got it.
I was a second grade teacher there. So I taught math, science, social studies, which was very weird because the curriculum was based off of the United States curriculum. And so I'm like,
Right.
I don't really know why I'm teaching students from like Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Japan and the US. I mean, the US makes slight sense, but like, I don't know why I'm teaching you all about the revolution. Like, so I did deviate from the textbook material a little bit and tried to take a slightly more global approach.
Oh, that's so funny. And then, I mean, so for some people who go and teach English in Japan, it can be sort of where you mainly just hang out with other Westerners who happen to be over there. What was your experience? Were you mixing with some of the locals? Did you pick up any Japanese? Or what was your experience like outside of the classroom?
Yeah, I did hang out with my share of foreigners while there. And I think part of it is, and anyone who has moved to another country, especially one where they do not speak the native language and you're studying it, because I was working on learning Japanese, and I was trying to not just be that person who's like, I'm just going to use English and be a pain to everyone else around me, and but it's exhausting. And I don't say that to be like, it is still worth it to learn the local language. If you are living somewhere, you should make that effort wholeheartedly. But sometimes it's like, until you are truly fluent, like you don't have to think about what you're saying and it just comes naturally. There is always that like extra effort your brain is putting in. And so you definitely get like a little worn down and a little exhausted and, all of that. And so I definitely hung out with my foreigner crowd, but I also had a good couple friends who were local that I made that, we would go out and we would go out drinking and go out, just hang out at places and coffee shops and whatnot. And hang out with the local crew as well, in tandem with hanging out with other foreigners. But it was during that time to kind of bring it back to the original question of, the gap between Air Awakens and sixth grade. Air Awakens I actually drafted while I was living in Japan. And so that was I would steal in a couple words on the lunch break or during recess. So I would get home and I would get, my 1,000 or 2 words in, and then go to bed and rinse and repeat. And
right. What was the catalyst to that, the first time you sat down and started writing, what kicked it off for you?
I think it was 3 things. The first was at that time, because it's 2012, the Thor movies were coming out, the Marvel Thor. And I thought Loki / Tom Hiddleston was one of the hottest characters in existence. And I was like, I'm going to write a fan fiction. And then I stopped myself and I was like, do I actually want to write a fan fiction or do I want to write a story about an impossibly attractive man? Because I knew this about myself, an impossibly attractive dark-haired man. Because I knew this about myself from 6th grade where I'm like, if I start writing a fan fiction, I'm going to get 100,000 words into it and I'm not going to be able to do anything with it because it's based on fan fiction. And this was pre like publishers picking up fan fiction. That was not a thing until the past, couple years.
All right.
Not really, not at scale. And so I saw myself for that. There was a song Clarity by Zed that kind of like I had this image of a woman in the center of a magical windstorm and a man trying to get to her. And of course he's dark-haired and possibly attractive. And I was like, the lyrics of the song is like, our love is insanity, our love is clarity. And I was like, why? Why is there love insanity? Why is it clarity? And I had those 2 forces combining with one of my really good friends who also worked at the school I worked at. She wanted to be an author. And so we would carpool and she would talk about writing and talk about stories. And of course, it's something I've always been passionate about, but it really got backburnered in school. I think I got a little burnt out from school. I had to write and read so much for school that I didn't do it as much in my free time. And so it was like this renaissance for me of like, oh, right, this is really fun. It's really fun to talk about stories and to write things. And so I would like write a chapter and we'd talk about it the next day in the car. And she would tell me like, oh, I'm going to write this weekend. And it was, it was great for building that momentum and excitement.
So cool. And and I suppose that real like lightness and enjoyment that you're experiencing doing it is finding its way onto the page as well. And whoever's reading it can feel that kind of excitement that you're feeling. I mean, obviously it's one thing to start writing that as an exercise, but then you start posting the chapters online for others to read. What took you to that step and how long did it take you to find an audience?
I started posting immediately. And I think that was because I came at it with like this fan fiction mindset, which in fan fiction, for anyone who doesn't read, that's very common. Like authors will post a chapter in their fan fiction regularly or not. I mean, some people follow fan fictions for years, hoping they'll get finished. And so I was posting on a site called Fiction Press, which was a cousin to fanfiction.net. Fanfiction.net was like a precursor to AO3. Fiction Press was a precursor to Wattpad. And so I just thought like, I'm going to write something and I want to share it with people. And again, fan fiction mindset. I wasn't even thinking about publishing. It wasn't an idea of like, oh, I need to build an audience or I need to be strategic or this is going to turn into like a thing. I was like, I just want to write a book and have some fun with it. So I started posting a chapter a day. And I think it was the fact that I was posting a chapter a day for an entire year building this series. That was really what found momentum. And I think it was like by the end of month 1, I had I'd have to go back and double check my stats, but I think I hit like 100 people following me by the end of month 1. And I was like, this is great. Like, I have people commenting on my chapters when I post. People are like, I can't wait for the next one tomorrow. And it was that hype that kept me going for the entire year, where I drafted the whole of the Air Awakens series.
Right, we will pick that story up again in a minute, but for now, let's come to your third game. This is from 2003, so a couple of years after Final Fantasy X, but also a PS2 game. Tell us, what's the game, Elise, and why do you love it?
Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. This game, it came out in 2003. I don't think I played this game until probably 2006 or 2007. And it was one of those things where it was recommended to me by someone in college. And he was just like, you haven't played this game, you would love it. And I think the thing about Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne specifically was that it was the story. Again, it deals with an apocalyptic story. The world like ends in the first 5 minutes of the game. And of course, like a lot of Japanese IP, you end the game by like fighting God. It's just the natural progression of things.
It's where it has to end. Yeah.
It's where it has to end. But I think what the two things that made this game stick out for me was, one, you have a character and you go through and you pick a reason of like how you want to rebuild the world. And so that's basically the thing, is like the survivors of this apocalyptic event are going through the dystopian kind of hellscape thereafter. And you move through the game and you interact with those other characters, and the choices you make shape kind of like your reason and who you're going to stand with and what worlds you're going to sort of remake when you have that opportunity, should you defeat the divine being kind of thing. And so I think that was one of those things where I was like, oh, it stands out to me as one of the first games that I personally played where the choices I made really impacted the story that I got and the end result at the end. And I was like, that's a really cool mechanic. And then the other thing too was a gameplay perspective moment of, they have summons in the SMT games, and which Final Fantasy does as well, but they're different. It's almost like more intense Pokemon. I don't know how to describe. If you played it, you know what I'm talking about. But I loved the turn-based nature of the game. I love turn-based games, and I loved I'm trying to think of what they're called, and all I can think of are the Chalice dungeons, and that's Bloodborne. But there was this like never-ending. It had like 100 floors, and that was one of the first times in a video game that I was like, I'm gonna get to the end of this, and it really tested my patience.
Yeah. That's so funny. A lot of those Atlas games have that, don't they? Once you finish the game, you can go and do those endless castles or whatever they are. All right, let's come back to your games, to your story. So we left you. You've been posting these chapters. You've got a small following that's increasing. It's become a sort of virtuous circle of you're enjoying it and getting good feedback. People are excited for the next chapter. You decide to like send it out when it's finished to some publishers. How was it? Just tell me about that experience.
Yeah, so I write all 5 books in the span of a year. It ended up totaling, I think it was just around 1 million words, which I still feel like I entered in a 12-month fugue state. In retrospect, I don't know how I did that.
It's too many words.
It's so many. It's so many. And honestly, I edited later because, of course, you edit before publication, and the edited versions are like 500,000 words. So I cut out a series from the series when I was editing. It was insane. But But that's what happens when you don't understand story and you're just writing off the cuff and you don't have a plan of anything you're doing and you write a lot of stuff that you don't actually need. But so I finished the books. I am sort of in the process of looking at when I'm coming home from Japan. As much as I love being there, I knew that it wasn't going to be like my forever location. I had studied to the point that when I was in practice, I would say I was conversationally confidently around an N3 for anyone who knows the Japanese tests. Maybe on a good day with not too technical conversation, like maybe an N2 conversationally. My reading and writing was terrible. So I'm like, this is not going to be my forever home. I loved being here. I loved what I did. I loved the experience for myself, but it is not what I studied to do. Time to go back to the US. In the process of that, I have these books, and I remember that a friend of a friend from college was actually a published author. And so I reached out to my what it is our mutual friend, and I was like, "Hey, can I get her contact because she knows how publishing works?" And she was so generous with her time. She read Air Awakens, the draft. She gave me what is basically the equivalent of an edit letter. Like, she walked me through how querying agents works because that's the first part in the process. And yeah, she walked me through that, and I decided to query agents because I was never against independent publishing or self-publishing. I use the terms interchangeably, but I again at that time, publishers weren't picking up independently published books. And I wanted to see what my options were. So I went ahead and I queried, and I queried 111 agents. I think I had 7 partial requests. I had like 2 or 3 full requests and no offers of representation. And so that was that.
So just for anyone who doesn't know that this business, you're trying to get an agent who will then represent your book to sell it to a publisher. That's the kind of like the steps that you're describing here.
Exactly. And so and most publishers will not accept, they call it unsolicited submissions. They won't accept that from just like a person. They only talk to agents. And so it's a gatekeeping process. And that's what it is. And so I was like, all right, well, I was never against independent publishing. I have a business background. It doesn't scare me. I like the idea of making my own business. Let's do it. So, at this point, I had moved back to the States. I was working at a large company in their social media, for their social media. And I decided to publish the first book, August of 2015. I had taken about a year to like, after querying the agents, to like prep, get my marketing plan together, do the editing, all of that. And then by January of 2026, I became a full-time author with the release of the 3rd book in Air Awakens, and I've been a full-time author ever since.
So good. Amazing. And, how much, you said earlier that obviously you've studied business, you have an MA in it. How much of that, the early success you enjoyed do you think was sort of creative instinct, and how much was just your business training that you'd had?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I think the thing about this industry, and this is what I tell new authors constantly, whether they're indie, whether they're traditionally published, is that luck plays a factor. That is a big factor, frustratingly. I see books all the time where I'm like, there's no reason why this book shouldn't be flying off the shelves, and yet no one has read it. And I think that, having the business background definitely helped set things up for momentum. But I also got really lucky. And I feel like if I portray it as anything but that kind of weird combination, it would be a little disingenuous because there is that component where you can do everything right and you still don't find success in publishing.
Yeah, fair. At a certain point, and you write about this on your website, you're very generous with like giving your insights, I would say. And for anyone who's listening to this and is interested or already trying to do this, I recommend that they head to your website and read your FAQ page because it's really, really helpful and well done, I think. To anyone. But you go into one of, the differences between self-publishing and independent publishing and being with a major publisher. And you've done both, of course. What made you decide to eventually, try and publish some books with a publisher, established publisher?
There were a couple of factors. One, and they're both personal and business. And that's another thing that I tell people all the time is I'm like, it's not a one size fits all. It's what works for you and what works for the book. And so on a business level, I felt like I had reached as almost like I had reached as many readers as I could on my own. But there is a thing about traditional publishing of you are going to reach readers that you can't reach independently. And those are bookstore readers, because it is really hard to get independently published books into bookstores because of the distribution systems and also the cost, because traditionally published books have the benefit of economies of scale. They're printing thousands of copies at a time, so each per unit cost is very small. And so they can offer bookstores a really deep discount. I think industry standard is usually between like 50 and 55%, but don't quote me on that. And so, they can offer that to the bookstores and for the bookstores to carry their books. Independent authors can't really do that because since you're print on demand, you're printing a book when someone wants it. And because of that, each copy costs so much more to print than a large print run. So, I had the luck and I had the good fortune that I had booksellers that believed in me, and a lot of them would order in my independent titles, but I didn't have a big bookstore rollout. So there were doors that could be opened with traditional publishing that you just can't open as an indie. And I wanted to expand my reach and also to give readers an opportunity, my existing readers, an opportunity to get beautiful copies. Like, Arcana Academy in the States has gilded edges. In the UK, there was this fabulous Waterstones edition with sprayed edges. The cases of the regular editions had like different cases and stuff, and that was really cool. And so those are things I can't do as an indie. So there was that. There was also on a personal level, my husband and I were looking at starting a family and having a kid, and there is an undeniable element of traditional publishing that you are outsourcing. Like, even though traditionally published authors do a lot of marketing themselves, the publisher does take on some of that, ideally, in a good relationship, they do. But the publisher takes on the art direction, the finding the cover illustrator, the coordinating things like tours or events. They take on uploading the book to retailers and formatting it. And those are all things you have to do as an indie author. And I loved doing them. I still love doing them. But I was like, if I get pregnant and have a baby, my time is going to be much less. And outsourcing is a good idea.
And then there's a risk the machine just stops, right? Because you're not spinning the wheels, right?
Exactly. So it was a balance of a personal decision for me and based on what was going on in my life, as well as a business decision for where I was at in my career.
Makes sense. All right, let's come to your fourth game. I feel like there's been a trajectory in your game choices that was inevitably leading us to this series. The entry that you picked is from 2006, another PS2 game. Tell us, what's the game?
I believe, if I remember the order I put these games, was it Persona 3? If not, it is now.
It is Persona 3, yeah.
Obviously another Atlas title. I was trying not to have two. This was the one I agonized the most over because I was like, do I want to put this one? Do I want to put Skyrim? That was another one that almost made it on the list. And there were a couple other really formative like PS3 games and stuff that I loved. But the reason why I put Persona 3 was because it had the turn-based gameplay that I loved. But the Persona franchise, for anyone who doesn't know, it is a sort of choose-your-own-adventure RPG meets dating sim meets dungeon crawler. And it does all of those at the same time, somehow very well.
Meets psychotherapy as well, I would say.
Meets psychotherapy. Yes, definitely that. I mean, there's like I said with Shin Megami Tensei, you fight God at the end in some of them, but the visuals of Persona 3 specifically, and if you've played the game, they have what are they called? Invokers. It's something like that, but they're shaped like guns and they trigger warning. Violence, shoot themselves in the head, and they're not actually though. It's like magically shooting yourself in the head because you're bringing out your persona from your id or whatever. And I think again, it was one of those games, and it goes to the importance, I think, of storytelling in the hook, of like in that initial playing of the game, that first moment in the beginning when you're on the rooftop and it's the midnight hour, and everyone's in a coffin and it's bloody and you don't know why you're not and you don't know what's happening, and you run to the rooftop and you see this monster and someone falls and you grab as the main character, you grab their invoker. I could be using the wrong word. And you're, I don't know, apparently the main character had the sense to just metaphorically shoot themselves in the head about that. But it's so shocking and the imagery is so evocative that it just, and the music, I have written to the final boss theme of Persona 3 so many times. I write to a lot of video game music, but that one is like on my list of like my top tier video game OST songs.
So good. I'll play that one while you're talking. What's the vibe then? So of that particular track, is it one that you put on when you've got an action sequence or something more melancholic?
Oh, it's definitely an action sequence. Definitely like the big bad evil guy is revealing his master plan kind of vibes.
Right. Yeah, got it. So good. What a great series that is. Okay, well, we'll come to your like fifth game in a minute. Just before then, I said in the intro, your books sold millions of copies, which is, too many for a human mind to, imagine, I think. And that's interesting when you have so many people that are enjoying worlds that start off quite intimately and privately, whether you're writing them in Japan while you're teaching English in the daytime or in your study or whatever it might be. Yeah, what's it been like watching the stories that started out in, quite humble circumstances turn out to be such huge successes?
It's very surreal. It doesn't feel real. And I think it's constantly, the biggest thing that sits with me is when I started getting translations, and I was first translated into Turkish, and I think that happened in 2017, was when I was translated into Turkish with Air Awakens. And I've been translated into, I think at last count, I'm up to like 16 or so translations, either out or forthcoming into different languages. Still no Japanese yet, though. So if you're a Japanese publisher, call me. But I think the biggest thing is like I have had the privilege of touring around the world, and it is so incredible to me how readers from vastly different backgrounds will resonate with stories and characters. How I have a reader here in the United States telling me that Air Awakens was formative for her high school years, at the same year that I have a reader in Chile who is saying that they just found Air Awakens for the first time and they love Vala and they're finding, they're loving her so much. And, the year before I was in Germany and for the finale of Air Awakens coming out there, it's a reminder that we're all just people at the end of the day. Like there are these elements and these stories that are just these elements of stories that are just universal. And we all want to find out who we are. We all want to have a place in the world. We all want to have a purpose. We all want to do brave things, and we want to be good at the end of the day. And we want a world where good triumphs over evil. We want to love deeply and feel deeply. And I think that there is so much noise about how different we are sometimes that it's for me a constant reminder of like, but we all can relate to these stories, whether they're mine or someone else's. Like, it's just we are fundamentally all more similar than we are different.
Yeah, such a great antidote to how the mechanisms of social media are trying to pit everyone against each other. But you're so right. Literary success is a wonderful thing, right? And it brings all sorts of freedoms, I imagine, to your life that perhaps you could never have imagined when you were, 27 and first writing the book. But also, success also has a darker side. And one of the things is that it brings expectations, I suppose. And perhaps it's harder for you to be quite so free as you were when you and your friend in Japan were writing your chapters and, sharing all that information. Do you feel, and particularly with this new book, did you feel a million people peering over your shoulder when you were trying to write it?
Every book you want to be better than the last as an author. But I think one of the things that I have hard learned being in this industry for as long as I have been is that not everyone is going to like every book. And, my sophomore series, The Loom Saga, compared to my Air Awakens series, was an utter flop. Like, it was a commercial failure by objective measurements. And I can look back and be okay with that now. But I think it's
Did you struggle at the time then when it was all happening?
Absolutely. Because I was riding this high of Air Awakens of, the last book in the series hit USA Today, and I had all of these readers and everyone was loving it. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to put out another fantasy series and everyone's going to love that too because, it's fantasy. And I learned a lot about genre and that there's not as much genre crossover as one might think or hope. I learned a lot about branding as an author and how you sort of have this expectation with readers of, readers sort of expect plus minus a little wiggle room, but a certain type of book from you as an author. And it is hard to break that expectation and continue to have momentum. And there are many authors who do it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying I think there are probably more stories of people struggling doing that than there are people finding wild success every time they do it. I learned a lot from that. And in a weird way, it's very strange to say, I am grateful for it now because of what I learned. But it's an all's well that ends well gratitude. Like, it really was, that was a stretch of time in like 2017 to like 2018 or so where I was like, all right, if something doesn't kind of turn around, if I don't find my momentum again, I'm getting a day job again. I'm not saying I'm out of the game, but I'm not a full-time author anymore. And that's also okay. If that had happened, it didn't, and I didn't want it to, but it would have been fine. I'm not saying that authors who have to do that, there's any shame in. But yeah, I mean, that was a rough stretch for sure.
Yeah, right. And how have you dealt with those expectations? Because I suppose to a certain degree, you want to be aware of those market forces, but that's not why you started telling stories. It was because you wanted to sell lots of books necessarily, or make lots of money, or whatever it would be. You've kind of got your own vision and you want to stay creatively true to that. So how do you separate some of that noise of what everyone else wants from what you feel like you're being called to put into the world?
I say I'm lucky in that I have more ideas than time to write. And I also write in a genre I love. I would be lying if I said that I didn't have weird, quirky ideas. Some of them are written that I just haven't published because they don't fit the Elise Kova brand of what it is right now. Hopefully someday they'll see the light of day. I expect them to eventually. But I think when it is your full-time job and it is how you pay the bills, you do have to be mindful to a certain extent of the expectations. But I also am a fundamental believer as an author that if you're not having fun writing it, your readers aren't going to have fun reading it. And so I always try and find, where's the center of that Venn diagram of what kind of the market wants and what reader expectations might be from me, and of everything that I want to write. There's usually something that fits in that middle where I'm like, that I'm really excited about, and I think my readers will love it too. But it is intimidating because I don't want to let people down. Books are expensive too, and the economy is
true.
tough. And like, I feel bad when someone is like, I spent all this money on this nice hardcover and I hated the book, and I'm like, shit, I'm sorry. Like, I really am.
Thanks for talking about that. That's really, really helpful. All right, Elise, let's come to your fifth and your final game. One of my absolute favorites of all time from 2015. The first FromSoft game on this list. Tell us, what is it and why do you love it?
It is Bloodborne. And I had a very hard time not making this entire list, just Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 through 3, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. I am a FromSoft junkie. Got into it with Demon Souls. I think this is the first one where I didn't put my introduction game on the list, but I put Bloodborne specifically because there is something about that game, and you say you love it too, so I'm sure you know what I'm about to say. It brings you back. Like when I think about, I want to replay a FromSoft game, or someone is like, what FromSoft game should I start with? I have always recommended Bloodborne. It's never Dark Souls 1. It's never Dark Souls 3. It's never Demon Souls, even though that got a remake. And even, now I kind of recommend Elden Ring because Bloodborne is showing its age. We still haven't gotten the, what is it, like the upgrade of the frame rate, like remastered edition of Bloodborne or anything like that. So, like, but what I love about FromSoft games, and this is something that speaks to me as an author, is I love the environmental storytelling that FromSoft is known for and is so good at. And I love trying to do that with my stories, where it's like you have kind of the plot happening and the story happening, and you can just coast on that. Like you can ride the top of the water and you're going to have a good time, hopefully. Hopefully you don't regret buying that hardcover. And you enjoy yourself. But if you want to dive deeper, like I try and seed my books with all of those little connections like FromSoft does in its games, where, you can look and you can be like, oh, wait a second, why did she describe that statue here and this statue here? Maybe that's something about the history or the lore or foreshadowing for what's to come. And like Bloodborne specifically just was that game for me, man, more than any of the other FromSoft games, save for maybe Elden Ring. But I put Bloodborne first because it was the precursor to Elden Ring for me.
Yeah, so good. And such a unique, like, aesthetic in Bloodborne as well. It's very, like, Scottish castle at night, isn't it? In a way that the others aren't quite the same, so...
Yeah, that little bit of, like, weird, almost gas lamp, steampunk, Victorian meets the castles, and, I also love Eldritch horror. I love Lovecraftian horror, so that's another big component of the game.
Yeah, it's got a lot of that going on. Brilliant. All right, Lisa, let's go through your console. We've got The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy X, Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, Persona 3, and Bloodborne. I love it. What a great console. How are you feeling about it?
I feel good. Again, some honorable mentions that were a struggle to cut in Skyrim and Elden Ring and whatnot, but I feel like I can justify every game that made it there, and I feel good about it.
Yeah, very good. Right. I ask all my guests to name their console so that we can market it to the world. You've named lots of successful things in your career. What would you like to call your console? Any ideas?
Oh, that's so hard. You don't know how long I agonize over book titles usually.
Well, we could base it on one of your book titles if you think one would fit.
Let's call it the RPG Academy. It's a good baseline of a lot of different RPGs that are formative to the genres. I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to get a great education off this one. Yeah, for sure. Very nice. Okay, so the RPG Academy. This has been so nice, Elise. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and all your wisdom as well. It's been so good. Last thing, the book is out in July, Prince of Swords. Where can people get it? And I assume they have read the first one before they dive into this one?
Yes, you definitely want to read Arcana Academy before you pick up Prince of Swords. Arcana Academy is out in hardback. I believe the paperback is going to be out before Prince of Swords release or right around. My publisher is probably screaming at their headphones right now. But that will be out as well if you prefer a paperback format. It's also available in ebook and audiobook. Prince of Swords will be out in kind of all places books are sold across North America, the UK, Europe in English and European translations to follow of the various languages throughout Europe, and Australia, New Zealand as well. In Australia, New Zealand, it will be out in paperback format, and Europe has a paperback format as well that will be out. So you can pre-order it Barnes & Noble, Waterstones, Amazon, your local indie bookstore. Go to your local indie bookstore and support them and tell them that you want it, because that really does help authors. But I hope you'll give Arcana Academy and Prince of Swords a shot.
Very good plug. That's the business MA coming out there at the end. Love it.
Telling people where to go.
Like, yeah, exactly. I kind of think Arcana Academy sounds like a PlayStation Japanese RPG I definitely would have played like back in the day.
I would be so into it if it got made into a game. I'm telling.
Yeah, well, you've done all of the work, haven't you, on the cards and everything? It feels like it could be an indie game now quite easily.
That, the teams that are, behind Expedition 33, give me a call.
Yeah, just a tiny little team with
not
much on their hands right now.
They don't. I don't think they have anything going on right now.
Amazing. Thank you, Elise. This has been amazing. All the best for the book launch.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you to my guest, Elise Kova, the fantasy novelist. So grateful to Elise for coming on the show, for telling us her really quite extraordinary story from publishing chapters of fan fiction while teaching English in Japan, north of Tokyo, to becoming a very successful self-published author and then joining one of the big 5 publishers. That's the term given to the largest 5 book publishers in the world, and she's with one of those now. And by all accounts, an absolute bestseller all around the world. Her new book, Prince of Swords, the sequel to Arcana Academy, is out this July. You can pick it up wherever you get your books. I think if you're here in the UK, you can get a special edition in Waterstones, which is what Waterstones does with books that they want to give a special treatment to, that I think they anticipate selling lots of copies of. And but from all accounts, there are special editions all around the world, whatever territory you're in. I'm sure you'll be able to pick up a version of that to meet your needs, whether it's an e-book or an audiobook or a physical copy. So once again, that's Prince of Swords. It's out this July, and the author is Elise Kova. I really recommend, as I mentioned in that interview, that you head along to her website, which is elisekova.com. Very easy to remember. That's elisekova.com. You can see all of the different books that she's written, the different series. You can purchase some of them on her shop. But also, as I mentioned, she has a really great FAQ on the website where you can learn all about not only Lisa's her process, etc., but also she answers lots of questions that anyone who wants to get into this sort of world of writing fantasy novels. It's just got loads of pearls of wisdom there. Like I said, she's been pretty generous with sharing the things that she's learned along the way. And so, yeah, if you're at all interested in that kind of thing, then why not head to her website? That's elisekova.com. Absolutely loved hearing her story. And as well, those 5 games are a real particular slice, aren't they, of Japanese video games. It is strange. I think perhaps Ocarina of Time hasn't been picked more on the show. It is probably in the top 5 best games ever made, I would say. Certainly one of the most influential, and so many of the games that we enjoy today owe at least part of that DNA to Ocarina of Time. I think the most recent version of it that you could play that's not emulated on the Switch was on the Nintendo 3DS, and it's a really, really good version of that. I mean, not that easy to get hold of a 3DS these days, I suppose, certainly not new. But yeah, if you've got any interest in playing that game, if you've never played it before, then I heartily recommend you go and do that. We've had quite a few N64 Zelda titles picked recently, haven't we? Stephen Totillo picked Majora's Mask, and it's going to be coming up again in future weeks, so look out for that as well. But yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with some N64 love, I don't think. So yeah, very grateful to Elise for coming on and sharing her game picks and for talking about them so wonderfully. How good was that blast of music as well from Final Fantasy X? Nobuo Uematsu, the composer of that piece of music and of so many of those classic melodies from Squaresoft, Square Enix. Well, the company had various names over the years, but he was really instrumental in all of those, wasn't he? I'm speaking to Nobuo, in fact, in a few weeks, not for this podcast, alas, but for a piece that will be out next year. So I'll tell you all about that a bit nearer the time. But yeah, I have got a few things, brewing that I want to tell you about. My main big book is going to be out in January. It is titled Trial of the Space Invaders: The Case That Changed Video Games. I've talked about it a few times on the show before, but I'm going to have physical copies or proofs quite soon, and with all this book chat in this episode, there might be a nice moment to tell you a little bit more about it. It is the story of really a pretty unknown court case, I would say, between Nintendo, apropos of this episode, and a TV manufacturer from America called Magnavox. That might ring a bell for some of you because Magnavox was the company behind the very first video game console, the Odyssey, released in 1972. And the Odyssey was, that technology was based on a bunch of different patents that were designed by an inventor called Ralph Baer. I'm sure those of you who know your video game history will have heard of Ralph and will probably have heard of his patents, because throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Magnavox went around instigating legal proceedings against any companies that wanted to make video games, basically, and said, hey, we own the rights to the patents behind video game technology. If you want to continue Atari to produce Pong, then you need to pay us some money. What you probably don't know is that they did that with Nintendo, and they took more than $10 million from Nintendo, who was at the time making, this is all before the NES, when they were making the TV game 6 and other machines. And Nintendo bring out the Famicom in Japan and does very, very well. And then a couple of years later, they want to bring out the NES in North America. And Magnavox comes knocking and says, hey, Nintendo, remember that deal we used to have and how you paid us loads of money? Well, you've got to keep paying us loads of money. And Nintendo says, not only are we not going to pay you the money, we're going to take you to court. We're going to prove that those patents that were awarded back in the late 60s and early 70s were fraudulently obtained. It is a really killer story about who invented video games. Nintendo went to court. They spent millions of dollars to prove who was the rightful inventor of video games, in order that they would not have to pay all of this money to the patent holders. In fact, in order to clear the decks so that anyone who wanted to make a video game or make a video game console could do so without the threat of litigation. This court case, this trial, occurs in 1988. It lasts, well, from the very first proceedings, it lasts for 6 years, and it ends in a secret settlement. And my book tells the story of the trial and reveals, I think, what was in the secret settlement and how it changed the landscape of video games. It's really exciting. I cannot wait to share it with you. It's a proper thriller. It's a real true story from the world of video games. There are lots and lots of books about video games in the world. I've written some of them myself. There aren't very many true stories that come from video games that have a cast of characters that have stakes like this. And that's what I'm hoping this book will be. It's called Trial of the Space Invaders: The Case That Changed Video Games. It's out in January. I will let you know as soon as you can pre-order it. It's going to be coming out in North America and the UK first, and then other countries after that. Consider this your warning. I'm going to be talking about it more, and when we have like the audiobook recording, I might even put out a bit of it on this podcast for you to listen to. I spoke to many of the lawyers who were involved in the case. I interviewed Howard Lincoln, the former president of Nintendo of America. He doesn't give interviews anymore. I've got a great story of how I got to speak to him. There's lots more for me to reveal as the weeks and months go by, but have that in your head that is coming up soon. Another book project I've worked on that's completely different, but I've been working with the folks at Tune and Fairweather. As some of you might know, a few years ago I put out a book of collected essays along with an interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki, the creator of Bloodborne, in a book called Blood Echoes. That came out with Tune and Fairweather, which creates extremely beautiful, lavishly produced books, predominantly about From Software games. They're branching out, and I've edited their new book, Look for the Light, which is all about the Last of Us series. It's a collection of essays and pieces that have been previously published, some in the New Yorker, in the New York Times, in GQ, in Time magazine, but also a load of newly commissioned pieces for the book, and 2 very extensive interviews with Neil Druckmann. One that was taken by the founder of Tune and Fairweather when he worked for Edge, Jason Killingsworth. He interviewed Neil and some of the other members of the team right before the very first release of The Last of Us. That full interview is available in the book for the first time. And then earlier this year, I spoke to Neil Druckmann for about 2 hours. Sony gave me with him. And we just talked about his memories, about the history, the very earliest days when he came up with the idea for the story while he was still a student, how he tried to turn it into a graphic novel, how he then pitched it at Naughty Dog, where he was working at the time, not quite sure if he should do that or not, because of course if he pitched it and they turned it down, he wouldn't be able to take it anywhere else. We talk about the production of the games, the TV series on HBO, which millions of people have watched now. And Neil really opens up and tells us some things that I think he's never spoken about before. All of that's going to be in the book. It's available for pre-order now. Head to Tune and Fairweather. Their website, you will be able to pre-order a copy. I'll let you know when it's on sale. All right, that's enough ads. Is it enough ads? Probably not. I've got one more. You need to head to patreon.com/myperfectconsole if you'd like to support the show. Thank you so much to those of you who do. It would be lovely to have more of you. Head there. You can become a free supporter, or you can become a paid supporter, and you'll get some various bonuses, including one bonus episode once a month with myself and Glenn Moore. And we are currently playing through Half-Life 2. If you would like to join us in that, dust off your old copy of the orange box, get playing, and later this month we'll have a special episode in which Glenn and I discuss the very great merits of Half-Life 2. You also get your episodes early and ad-free. Follow us on social media. You can do that on Blue Sky, Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok. And a shout out to the good people at Big Games Machine for all of their help in running the socials. Much appreciated to them. You write to me at myperfectconsole@gmail.com with your thoughts, with your suggestions, with your ideas for future guests. Yes, I agree with the 60 of you who have emailed me saying, please get John Carpenter onto the podcast. I have emailed him, at least via the email on his website. He hasn't got back to me yet, but perhaps someone listening to this can give me a hookup to John Carpenter, because there's a big appetite to hear him on My Perfect Console. Okay, next week. I'm so excited about next week's guest. It is a composer who I only became aware of earlier this year, or perhaps at the tail end of 2025, when he popped up on Instagram. Someone was talking about this beautiful album he put out last year called Polar. He is an Icelandic composer. He is called Gabriel Olafsson. He goes by Gabriel Olafs on Spotify. That's his sort of artist name. You may well have heard his music. It's been streamed millions and millions of times on Spotify. It's completely beautiful. He creates these amazing fantasy sort of worlds inspired by Hideo Kojima's work, but other places as well. Polar is the album that I recommend you go and listen to. He's got a track on the new Forza Horizon that's just come out. He's worked with Hans Zimmer. He is also the founder of the Reykjavik Orchestra. He's like 23 years old or something. He's so young. He's with Decca, very serious classical music. What's the word? Publisher, record company, record label. That's the word I'm looking for. He's a big deal. I think he's going to score some huge movies in the future. His music is amazing, genuinely amazing. And he loves video games so much. I mean, he's one of those people who was a child prodigy, like, playing Rachmaninoff when he was 6 years old, that kind of thing. But now he's a composer, very melodic, influenced, as I say, by these fantasy video game worlds. I love his music. I love my conversation with him. I'm so excited to bring you this conversation. It's something a little bit different, and yet at the same time so embodies everything that I want this show to be about. So please do join me again next week when I'll be back with Gabrielle with his 5 games and with one more, Perfect Console.